Welcome back to another episode of the Open Source Cafe, and we're really excited for this one because we have Marco joining us again. Marco, thanks a lot for joining. And today we're talking about how to hack Kubernetes, and how
Yeah.
to protect it. So we're talking about, in order to learn more about protecting yourself, not just with kids, general rule of life. You have to be aware of the, in order to have the countermeasures, you have to be aware of like what problems you might face. Before we get started, Marco, would you like to give yourself a quick intro and what you do at
Yeah.
Teleport? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Kunal. Good to be back here in the Open Source Cafe. A little bit about myself. I've been a solutions engineer at Teleport for a little over a year. And what that involves is, custom configurations of Teleport solution into different customers and prospects organizations for secure access control to their infrastructure. And one of our biggest use cases is indeed Kubernetes, right? So
Hmm.
securing access to your Kubernetes clusters and enabling more detailed auditing and compliance with that.
Amazing. And can you share, for folks who may be new, can you share a little bit more about what Teleport is?
Yeah. Yeah, great. So Teleport is a secure access solution to your cloud or private infrastructure, right? So we use reverse tunneling and a short-lived certificate authority that's tied to your single sign-on provider to provide really easy access for your developers and engineers, right? This is passwordless, this is short-lived
Hmm.
secure access. And then also for the security and compliance side, we provide a full audit log and session recordings into your environments, like a Kubernetes pod, for example.
Amazing. And I've done some videos on that. You can check it out on my channel. But we're recording it in September 2022. So check out Teleport 10. It's out. Some pretty cool features in that. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about how to hack Kubernetes, the topic of discussion. Why are we, why do we need these tactics in order to be, in order to prevent us from getting hacked? Because um, so many folks are using Kubernetes, or if they are not, they're considering it. Because even though when we go at events and stuff, um, at conferences, we see that okay, there's a huge buzz around kids. But when I attend, like, tell me if you face this as well. When I attended like local meetups and stuff, and I asked them, "Hey, you using K8s?" And they're like, "No, it's too complex," you know. So folks are still, working around on it. Like if they're not using it, they're considering it. When it comes to security, though, it's not like there's several issues that may exist throughout the life cycle when it comes to like building, deploying, and like the runtime. So why is it important that we need these tactics in order to avoid getting hacked, basically?
Yeah, I just think with the current state of cybersecurity in general with the
Hmm.
world and the more complex infrastructure becomes, and also the more microservices people may add to their infrastructure, right? Kubernetes comes in to kind of optimize your workloads from a serverless, containerized manner. What happens with that, though, is Kubernetes then becomes another surface area of attack for your infrastructure because it's another piece of critical services running your hosting environments, right? So it's very important to secure that to prevent it from hacks. And where we see the biggest hacks is really just, loose security principles within your Kubernetes, right? It could be a very broad cluster role. It could be not using any role-based access controls within your Kubernetes clusters. And then additionally, right, are you logging the activity in your Kubernetes clusters to ensure that there's no funny business, right?
Hmm.
So it's definitely a really good tool for deploying and managing your environment, but then you have to think a bit more deeply about the security side as well.
Yeah, these are pretty like, we discussed it in the previous podcast, like around some of the best practices. I did one with Ben as well
Mm-hmm.
around it. Um, so, like you mentioned, too many rules and stuff. So following the principle of least privilege,
Yeah.
for example, and you mentioned building complex, like having complex, Kubernetes clusters. So I think that's like the reason why Kubernetes came into picture, like Kubernetes is complex so that your applications can be simpler, but then it poses it makes it difficult for you to, when there's like there are some compromised clusters, when there's someone attacking it, it can be a little bit overwhelming, which we'll talk more about later in this session. So let's dive straight into this, how to hack it and how to protect it. And you mentioned I'd like to start with RBAC, you
Mhm.
know. So you mentioned about RBAC. So let's talk a little bit more about that. But before diving into RBAC, can you maybe compare it with something like attribute-based access control, and how does it differ with that, and is it how good of a practice is that?
Yeah, so RBAC differs from the attribute-based access control in Kubernetes because in Kubernetes you have what's called a cluster role, right? Kubernetes API enables you to have roles that grants you a certain set of read, write, list, update permissions, maybe on your pods, on your namespaces, right, on all your Kubernetes components. With attribute-based access control, it's more revolved around the Kubernetes group systems masters, right? So more so not tied to an identity, which then prevents cohesive audit logging of your previous or upcoming activity within your log. So we really see customers, and this is what Teleport does ourselves, moving to RBAC based security posture, because in a role based access control plane, you have an identity for every action that's conducted within your Kubernetes cluster, right? Where with an attribute solution, you just have maybe the Kubernetes group that they ran that issue or ran that deployment on, right? It's not so clear tightly to credentials. So role-based access control gives you the ability to really have more detailed logging in your cluster. And we see that prevents a bunch of attacks.
Yeah, when you look at it, what it offers. You have the cluster-wide permissions when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to ABAC, and that's not very granular
Yeah.
when we talk about permissions. Cool. I believe we had a slide as well around this. We can spin that
Yeah.
up now.
I can share my screen. This slide for the open source cafe is going to be a bit teleport oriented, but that's okay because I work for Teleport, so I would not be a true Teleport employee if I didn't at least plug the Teleport strong suite here. But really, what Teleport does with the Kubernetes access is help uh, developers, engineers, and then organizations move towards that RBAC method of control through short-lived certificates, right? So as you can see in the Kubernetes cluster here, what Teleport does is run that proxy pod in your cluster as that method plane of access to your EKS, GKE, whatever type of Kubernetes cluster you're doing. And within that, that's going to act almost as a sidecar container within your Kubernetes cluster, right? So it's going to be auditing all of your activity, all of your kubectl API calls, right? But because it enforces MFA and it enforces RBAC, you're going to get a verified human that's accessing that Kubernetes cluster through that MFA, right? We like to avoid the 6-digit MFA code just due to SIM swapping or whatever may happen there. We really are moving towards a human verification biometric MFA where you hit a YubiKey or you hit a Touch ID, or even with Kubernetes, I think Face ID will be coming up shortly with the new MacBooks, perhaps. But that human forced MFA, Teleport enables you to activate that for access to your Kubernetes cluster, which is really cool. So you verify that the user is actually a human developer accessing it, right? And then in comes the RBAC. So the RBAC, that role-based access control, confirms that this person has a verified cluster role and Kubernetes group user within your cluster to then run these Kubernetes API commands within your environment. So that's what Teleport does at a high level. And maybe, Kunal, later I can just do a quick demo of what that access looks like, and you can record everything that occurs in the Kubernetes cluster in a videotape format. So that is the big differentiator with Teleport, is if you miss the audit logs, if the audit logs are not that granular in what happened, we actually give you a video style playback format within your Kubernetes cluster. It's really cool.
Awesome. Amazing. I'll leave all the links in the description below, so make sure you all check it out. And I believe you had an architecture diagram as well.
Yeah, I do. Let me pull that up. So this is kind of a Kubernetes architecture diagram, but in a lucid chart kind of manner, I threw this together with my team just to kind of showcase the different ways Teleport can work with your Kubernetes clusters, right? So Teleport does not have to be just living within your Kubernetes cluster, right? Teleport could also be deployed as a Helm chart within your Kubernetes cluster to manage other Teleport instances of your environment. So to just talk a little bit more about Teleport, Teleport does SSH access, it does database access, Windows RDP access, internal applications, and then, yes, also Kubernetes. So in a Kubernetes access scenario, right, you could have a Teleport cluster managed somewhere else. That involves kind of a proxy and auth service where we generate your SSO identity and use a short-lived certificate. And you could deploy Teleport as an agent, right, as a namespace. And what that will do is it will almost act as your sidecar container for logging and also act as a proxy for recording and that passwordless identity role-based access into your Kubernetes cluster. But you could also deploy Teleport as a service relay or agent, right, and connect multiple Kubernetes clusters into your environment to that one Teleport service. And what this does is if you have a lot of clusters within your VPC, within your private cloud, you can access them all through this plane, almost like a Bastion host, but through an encrypted reverse tunnel here. And then lastly, Teleport could also be leveraged within Kubernetes clusters for leaf clustering, right? So separating environments from dev, test, and prod, separating permissions at an entire cluster level as well, but all still pointing back to your main root Teleport cluster for that proxy and auth service.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for sharing. And I have one more, so since we're talking about preventing your clusters from being hacked, it's also very important to monitor the logs, especially when you have any authentication failures. So can you share a little more about how Teleport helps in the visibility of things?
Yeah, sure. Kunal, if you don't mind, I think the kind of the best way to do this would just be a quick demo.
Let's do that.
Yeah. So let me pull up my cluster. This is a Teleport 10 enterprise cluster, right? So with Teleport Enterprise, you get access to do different single sign-on, but because this is open source cafe, I'll use GitHub in honor of the open source community here. And as you can see, I've used my GitHub SSO to authenticate into my Teleport cluster. And when we go to Kubernetes, we can see I have a couple AKS clusters, EKS clusters tied to my Teleport environment. And the way that we do this, as I said earlier, is we have our own Helm chart that you could deploy into your Kubernetes cluster. So I can just call this namespace Teleport. I can call this cluster Kunal, right? And I could generate that script that sets that values.yaml within my EKS or GKE cluster back to my specific Teleport cluster for that auth and RBAC control. And if we look at Teleport within my roles, you can actually set a Kubernetes access role within Teleport. And what this does, if you look at my 3 lines here for Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes groups, Kubernetes labels, and Kubernetes users. This is where Teleport can take your GitHub identity or your SSO identity, map you to certain Kubernetes groups, right? Prevent you from seeing the wrong Kubernetes clusters. So I could do label environment equals dev, and then cloud equals EKS, right? Or AWS here. So these labels help provide that granular access to the right Kubernetes clusters. And then additionally, you could flag the specific user that your Teleport identity is able to assume as that RBAC within the Kubernetes cluster. So it's really cohesive from the RBAC method, starting at Teleport and then within your Kubernetes cluster. To connect, right, if I hit connect here, there's no browser-based Kubernetes IDE here. But what this does is you can see it updates your local kube config based off your proxy RBAC method from Teleport. So if I go to my command line, right, for the folks unfamiliar to Teleport, you can actually download Teleport locally and get that programmatic access. So I can do a TSH login, proxy address in my Teleport cluster, and my identity. It's going to check my identity to ensure I'm mapped to the right security group for that permission. Yes, I am. The login's successful. And you can see with Teleport, I get a short-lived certificate issued to me in the command line. And you can see those same 3 lines that I showed you in my Teleport RBAC. This user is mapped to dev cluster. I have access to different Kubernetes users, but I only have access to 2 Kubernetes groups with the certificate, right? Devs and systems masters. So knowing that, I can do a TSH kube list, see the access I have for certain clusters, right? And then all I need to do to update my kube config and begin running Kubernetes API commands is just do a TSH kube login and the name of that Kubernetes cluster, and my kube config has been updated. Now I can do certain API calls like get pods, right? I should have a few Nginx pods here as well as a shell demo. Yep, looks like that's still the case, right? So I have some deployments here. I can do a get namespaces, and I could show you that Teleport agent running to enable all this and have that auditing, right? So these 2 Kubernetes API commands are already going to be audited and make your security posture better and just make your compliance team, if you have one, happy, right? Because we see all this activity for my day so far, right? We saw the user was updated in Teleport. That short-lived certificate was issued for me. When I scroll down, we could see the Kubernetes permissions that I have against that certificate that's short-lived and when it's going to expire. And then we see a couple Kubernetes API calls, right? So in line 22 here, 22. This is a JSON format log. So what we see people do is forward this to Elastic, Sumo Logic, right, for additional alerting and monitoring. We could see I did a get pods here based off this Teleport log. And we could see which local address and which remote address I conducted this from and which Teleport user conducted this, right? That's the key difference between ABAC and RBAC is I have an identity tied to these commands and to these keystrokes, right? Same thing here, except I did a get namespaces. If I want to exec into my shell demo, I can still do that with Teleport. And it's going to use that certificate to authenticate me in. And I can run these various commands, right? I can check everything. I can exit out of here, clear this. And then if I just refresh that audit log, we're going to see that other Kubernetes request, and then we're going to see session metadata here. So we're going to see that exec session started, right, on my shell demo. Here's my Kubernetes pod, right? And then the key differentiator with Teleport is we're going to see in session recording, we're going to see this little Kubernetes icon, and we're going to see that Campana Marco, my GitHub identity, exec into my shell demo pod and ran some commands. And Teleport is able to play this back in a video format. So it's really cool because usually the famous word is if security is happy, your developers are not, or your engineers are not, or if your engineers are happy with the tool, security and compliance is not happy because it may pose some risks if it's too easy to use. Teleport merges that, right? It's the only tool that makes security happy and your developers happy. So yeah, that's a little bit of a demo of how we can kind of hack around your Kubernetes for security.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing. And I believe you can also do sessions with other folks like your team.
Yeah.
In Teleport. That's pretty cool. And good thing also you mentioned about the certificates being short-lived. So that's also one of the best practices when we talk about for your encryption keys and your certificates. Because in Kubernetes it's like it has an expiration date, but But yeah, I mean, K8s takes care of it. It's a good practice to keep it rotating
Yeah.
and updating your keys and stuff automatically. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for sharing, Marco. And other than that, yeah, I mean, other stuff that that's not new to this podcast. We've already discussed, like pretty standard stuff when it comes to getting hacked. Update your K8s version. Don't running containers as root
Yep.
non-root users or something like that.
Exactly.
And on all these other things, we've discussed it in the previous episode, so you can check out the links in the description below. Just one last question for you. What's your
Sure.
favorite feature of Teleport 10?
Ooh, my favorite feature of Teleport 10, it would have to be
Passwordless?
passwordless. I was gonna say it's a cool one. So Teleport 10 for all the teleport advocates here. With Teleport 10, right? You see, I have my single sign-on here. Can go into other options, and we can remove the username password from the equation, and I can go passwordless here. Tap my YubiKey, put in the PIN, and then pick my identity, right? And then try passwordless, where it looks like I picked the wrong auth there. Let's see if my GitHub is set up passwordless. Try this guy. See, there we go. So my YubiKey passed me through there. That's one of my favorite features, Kunal, but I would say from the customer side, right, the ability to, if I want to request new roles, right, now we can also request access to certain Kubernetes clusters or certain applications, certain databases. So it's kind of enabling users to not have to understand what all encompasses into a role in an organization. If they need access to a certain server, they need access to a Grafana, they could actually just request access to that certain resource or instance, and Teleport will generate a temporary role for that access to be able to be elevated and requested upon. So it's more of a dynamic access request, I think we're calling it, or search-based access request. So that's one of my new favorite features, is that now developers don't have to understand what every role encompasses when it comes to elevated permissions, right? They can just select a certain database, proceed, and go request that one specifically, and have a new short-lived role associated to that if the access request is approved. So that's one of my new favorite features as well.
Amazing. And just like that, you can find lots more in the links in the description below. And you can check out the DevOps playlist. We have a bunch of videos done on Teleport already. But yeah, always a pleasure, Marco. Thanks a lot for joining in and sharing your knowledge and all the great tips. And hopefully we'll get to do a little bit more in the future. And
yes, I hope so.
Yeah, this was fun. All right. Cool. Well, thanks for joining, and thanks everyone for watching as well. Do check out Teleport, and if you have any questions, leave those in the comment section below. You can follow Teleport on Twitter, join the community, and we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks for watching.